Let me tell you something that the mainstream media is deliberately not telling you. The United States, the most powerful military force in the history of the world, is standing at the edge of the Strait of Hormuz, and it cannot do a single thing about what is happening there, not because it lacks weapons, not because it lacks willpower, but because China has quietly, methodically, and brilliantly engineered a situation where American power simply does not apply anymore. And by the time this video is done, you are going to understand exactly how that happened, why it matters to your daily life, and why the people running Washington are more nervous right now than they have been in decades. Let's start with the basics, because I want to make sure you feel the full weight of what we're talking about. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow channel of water, barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, that sits between Iran and Oman. Through that tiny corridor flows approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply, 20%. That means 1 out of every 5 barrels of oil that powers cars, factories, ships, planes, and economies around the entire planet passes through that one choke point. If that strait closes, even for a week, you would see oil prices spike to levels that would make 2008 look like a minor inconvenience. You would see supply chains fracture. You would see inflation surge in ways that would hit ordinary working people in their wallets, at the pump, in the grocery store, and in their heating bills. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a geographic feature, it is the jugular vein of the global economy. And right now, Iran has its hand on that vein, and China is standing right behind Iran, making absolutely sure that the United States does not intervene. Now, here is where it gets really interesting. For the last 40 years, the American foreign policy establishment has operated on one core assumption, that US naval dominance in the Persian Gulf was permanent, unchallengeable, and essentially beyond question. The Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. American aircraft carriers patrol those waters routinely. Washington believed, genuinely believed, that its military presence alone was enough to deter any threat to the flow of oil through Hormuz. That was the deal. America provided the security umbrella. The Gulf states sold oil in dollars. Those dollars recycled back into US Treasury bonds. And the whole system, the petrodollar system, kept American financial supremacy intact. It was elegant. It was ruthless. And for a long time, it worked. But here is what the foreign policy establishment failed to account for. China was watching. China was learning. And China was building an entirely different kind of power, not military power in the conventional American sense, but economic, financial, and infrastructural power that would eventually make American military supremacy largely irrelevant in this particular theater. And that is exactly what has now happened. You are watching it unfold in real time, and most people have absolutely no idea. But before I explain exactly what China built and how it works, you need to understand the Iranian side of this equation, because Iran's position right now is stronger than it has been at any point in the last 30 years, and the reason why will genuinely shock you. Iran has been under American sanctions for over 4 decades. Let that sink in. 40 plus years of being cut off from the international banking system, being denied access to technology, being threatened with military action, having its assets frozen, having its currency attacked. The United States threw everything it had at Iran short of an outright invasion. And Iran is still standing, not just standing. Iran has actually expanded its regional influence dramatically over that same period. It has built alliances with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with the Houthis in Yemen, with various factions in Iraq and Syria. It has developed one of the most sophisticated missile arsenals in the Middle East. It has advanced its nuclear program to the point where it is now, by most credible expert assessments, weeks away from having the capability to produce a nuclear weapon if it chose to do so. Iran did not survive 4 decades of American pressure by accident. It survived because it had a strategy. And the core of that strategy, particularly over the last 15 years, has been to make itself indispensable to China. Think about what Iran has to offer China. It has the 4th largest proven oil reserves in the world. It sits in the geographic center of the Middle East, sharing borders with Iraq, Turkey, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and access routes to Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Persian Gulf simultaneously. It has a large educated population of over 85 million people. It has a military and intelligence apparatus with real operational experience in the region. For China, which needs reliable energy supplies and overland trade routes that do not depend on sea lanes that the US Navy can interdict, Iran is not just useful, Iran is strategically essential. and China recognized that fact long before Washington understood the implications. The 25-year Comprehensive Cooperation Agreement signed between China and Iran in 2021 is one of the most consequential documents in modern geopolitical history, and I promise you it received a fraction of the media coverage it deserved. Under that agreement, China committed to investing up to $400 billion in Iran over 25 years in energy infrastructure, transportation, manufacturing, telecommunications, ports, railways, and banking. In exchange, Iran agreed to supply China with discounted oil and gas and to grant Chinese companies preferred access to Iranian markets and infrastructure projects. Read that again carefully. China essentially agreed to bankroll the modernization of the Iranian economy in exchange for guaranteed energy supplies and a strategic foothold at the most important choke point in the world. This is not charity. This is not ideology. This is pure strategic architecture, executed with a patience and a long-term vision that Washington simply does not possess. And here is where the story takes a turn that most analysts are still not talking about openly, because what China did next was not just about Iran. It was about rewiring the entire financial system that the United States uses to enforce its will on the world. When the United States sanctions a country, the mechanism is fundamentally financial. It works through the dollar, because the vast majority of international trade is invoiced in dollars and cleared through American banks or through the SWIFT messaging system that American authorities can access and control. Washington can effectively cut any country off from the global economy simply by threatening any bank that does business with that country. This is what they call secondary sanctions. You don't just sanction Iran directly. You tell every bank in Germany, Japan, South Korea, India, and everywhere else that if they process transactions for Iranian entities, they will lose access to the US financial system. And since losing access to the US financial system is essentially a death sentence for any major international bank, compliance was, for a long time, nearly universal. This is the dollar weapon, and it is the most powerful financial weapon ever constructed. But China has been systematically building an alternative. The cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, is China's answer to SWIFT. It processes transactions in Chinese yuan, it operates outside of American jurisdiction, and it has been quietly expanding its network of participating banks and institutions across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and even parts of Europe. It is not yet as large or as liquid as the dollar system, but it does not need to be, at least not yet. It only needs to be large enough to allow China and its partners, including Iran, to conduct the transactions that matter most to them without touching the dollar system at all. And that threshold has already been crossed. Iran and China now conduct the bulk of their bilateral trade in yuan and through barter arrangements that completely bypass the dollar. Iranian oil flows to China. Chinese goods, machinery, technology, and investment flow to Iran. No dollars change hands. No American bank is involved. No SWIFT message is sent. The sanctions, from an economic standpoint, are increasingly hollow, at least with respect to China-Iran trade, which is now running at levels that would have been unimaginable 10 years ago. Chinese imports of Iranian oil have been estimated at anywhere between 1 and 1.5 million barrels per day in recent periods, often disguised through ship-to-ship transfers and intermediary ports in Malaysia and Oman to obscure the origin. Washington knows this is happening. Washington has been largely powerless to stop it because the alternative, sanctioning Chinese state oil companies, would trigger a financial confrontation with Beijing that the American economy is simply not prepared to absorb. But we haven't even gotten to the military dimension yet. And that is where this story goes from serious to genuinely alarming for anyone who understands what deterrence actually means in the modern world. The conventional wisdom in Washington has always been that Iran could never actually close the Strait of Hormuz because the US Navy would reopen it by force within days. And 20 years ago, that conventional wisdom was probably correct. But two things have happened since then that have fundamentally changed the military calculus. First, Iran has built a layered anti-access and area denial capability in and around the strait that is now genuinely formidable. We're talking about hundreds of fast attack boats capable of swarming and overwhelming larger surface vessels, shore-based anti-ship missile batteries with sophisticated targeting systems, submarine capabilities in shallow waters where large American warships are most vulnerable, sea mines that can be deployed rapidly across the narrow shipping lanes, and a drone arsenal, both aerial and maritime, that has proven its effectiveness against Saudi oil infrastructure and against commercial shipping in the Red Sea through the Houthis, who are effectively an Iranian proxy force. The US Navy can defeat Iran in a full-scale conventional war, almost certainly. But defeating Iran in a full-scale conventional war is not the same as keeping the strait open. Iran does not need to win a war. It only needs to make the cost of keeping the strait open by force high enough that the political will to do so collapses in Washington. And that threshold is far more achievable than most American policymakers want to publicly admit. Second, and this is the part that China's role makes absolutely decisive, any American military action against Iran now carries the very real risk of direct confrontation with Chinese interests. China has made enormous financial and strategic investments in Iran. China has personnel operating in Iran. China has stated repeatedly and publicly that it opposes unilateral American sanctions and military threats against Iran. If the United States were to attack Iran and destroy the infrastructure that Chinese companies have built and are operating, or harm Chinese nationals in the process, the political and diplomatic fallout would be catastrophic. And behind the diplomatic fallout would lurk the far more serious question of what China might do in response, not necessarily in the Persian Gulf, but in Taiwan, in the South China Sea, in cyberspace, or in the global financial markets where China holds over $1 trillion in American Treasury securities and has the theoretical capability to create serious disruption if it chose to deploy that asset aggressively. This is what strategists call extended deterrence. And China has effectively extended its deterrence umbrella over Iran in a way that fundamentally constrains American freedom of action. It's not a formal military alliance. There are no mutual defense treaty obligations, but the practical effect is similar. Attacking Iran now means risking a confrontation with China, and that risk calculation has shifted the balance of power in the Persian Gulf in ways that the American foreign policy establishment is only now beginning to grapple with fully. Stay with me, because in part two, I'm going to show you exactly what this means for oil prices, for the dollar, for your cost of living, and for the broader question of whether American global dominance is actually already over, not in the future, but right now, today, in ways you can measure and feel. The deeper issue here is not just about Iran and China. It's about the entire architecture of American power and how that architecture was constructed and how it is now being systematically dismantled. American power since 1945 has rested on three pillars: military supremacy, dollar dominance, and control of key choke points and supply chains in the global economy. The Strait of Hormuz is all three of those things simultaneously. It's a military choke point. It's connected to the petrodollar system, and it sits at the heart of the global supply chain for energy. When China positioned itself as Iran's economic and de facto strategic guarantor at that choke point, it struck at all three pillars at once, not with missiles, not with tanks, with contracts, investments, currency arrangements, and the patient accumulation of leverage over a 15-year period while Washington was distracted by wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and by domestic political dysfunction. This is the nature of Chinese strategic thinking that Western analysts consistently underestimate. The Chinese approach is not to confront American power head on, where American advantages are greatest. It is to find the seams in the American system, the places where American power is overstretched, where American alliances are fragile, where American economic interests conflict with American geopolitical interests, and to quietly, steadily insert Chinese influence into those seams until the American position becomes untenable. And nowhere has that approach been executed more skillfully than in the relationship between China and Iran over the last 15 years. The United States spent 40 years trying to isolate Iran. China spent 15 years making that isolation meaningless. And now the United States finds itself in a position where it cannot effectively sanction Iran without confronting China, cannot threaten Iran militarily without risking Chinese retaliation in other theaters, and cannot maintain the petrodollar architecture of Gulf oil payments if Iran and China together successfully demonstrate that oil can be traded outside the dollar system at scale. Every one of those three failures represents a fundamental erosion of the American strategic position, not just in the Middle East, but globally. Because if it can happen in the Persian Gulf with the most strategically vital waterway on the planet, it can happen anywhere. That is why this story matters to you, not as an abstract geopolitical chess match between great powers, but as a direct, tangible threat to the economic order that your cost of living, your retirement savings, your job market, and your country's ability to fund its government and its social programs all depend on. The dollar's reserve currency status is not a technicality. It is the reason the United States can run enormous trade deficits without immediately suffering the consequences that any other country would face. It is the reason American interest rates are lower than they would otherwise be. It is the reason the US government can borrow cheaply to fund everything from Medicare to military bases around the world. If that status erodes, and it is eroding, not catastrophically yet, but measurably and persistently, ordinary Americans will feel the consequences in their daily lives in ways that no politician is currently being honest with them about. China's play in Hormuz is not just a foreign policy story, it is a story about the financial future of the United States and about who is going to bear the cost when that future arrives. And right now, the people at the top of the American financial and political system are working very hard to make sure that when the bill comes due, it is not paid by them. Part 2 is where we get into all of that. And trust me, you are going to want to hear what's coming next. Let's talk about what happens next, because this is where the rubber meets the road for ordinary people. And this is where the analysis gets uncomfortably real. The mainstream financial media wants you to believe that the dollar is fine, that American power is intact, and that whatever is happening in the Persian Gulf is a distant geopolitical drama that has nothing to do with your bank account. That is a lie, not a misunderstanding, not an oversight, a deliberate, calculated lie. Because the moment ordinary Americans understand the connection between what China is doing at Hormuz and what is happening to their purchasing power, their savings, and their economic future, they are going to start asking questions that the political establishment is absolutely not prepared to answer. Here is the direct connection. The petrodollar system, the arrangement where Gulf oil is priced and sold exclusively in US dollars, has been the single most important structural support for dollar dominance since 1974. It means that every country in the world that needs to buy oil must first acquire dollars. That creates a permanent structural global demand for the dollar that allows the United States to print money, run deficits, and borrow cheaply in ways that no other country on earth can replicate. It is the greatest financial privilege in history, and it is now under direct assault. Saudi Arabia has already begun conducting oil transactions in Chinese yuan. The UAE is doing the same. Iraq has authorized yuan-denominated oil trade with China. These are not isolated experiments. These are cracks in the foundation of the petrodollar system. And every crack makes the next one easier. When Iran and China demonstrated that you could trade oil completely outside the dollar system and survive, even thrive, despite American sanctions, they handed every other oil-producing nation a roadmap that says you do not have to play by Washington's rules anymore. There is another option, and that option is backed by the largest manufacturing economy and the largest energy import market on the planet. And if you think the cracks in the petrodollar are the worst of it, hold on, because the military dimension of this story is about to make everything else look minor. China has not just protected Iran economically. China has quietly ensured that Iran's military deterrence capability, specifically its ability to threaten the Strait of Hormuz, remains credible and functional. Chinese technology has found its way into Iranian drone programs, Iranian missile guidance systems, and Iranian naval capabilities, not through official military aid, which would be too provocative and too visible, but through dual-use technology transfers, through Chinese companies operating in gray zones of export control enforcement, and through the kind of quiet technical cooperation that intelligence agencies document but governments deny. The result is that Iran today has a genuine, credible, and increasingly sophisticated capability to impose enormous costs on any attempt to keep the Strait of Hormuz open by military force. And behind that capability stands the implicit knowledge in Tehran, in Washington, and in every major capital in the world that China has a vested interest in that capability remaining intact. This changes the entire strategic equation in the Persian Gulf. American aircraft carriers that once projected unchallengeable dominance now operate in an environment where Iranian anti-ship missiles, drone swarms, and submarine threats impose real operational constraints. The US Navy has not faced a serious peer or near-peer naval threat in decades, and its doctrine, its platforms, and its institutional culture are all shaped by an era of total maritime dominance that may already be over. The people inside the Pentagon who understand this are genuinely alarmed. The people in Congress who control the defense budget are largely still living in 1995. What China has built around Iran is essentially a deterrence bubble, a zone where American military action carries costs and risks that the American political system is not currently willing to absorb. And here is the brutal strategic reality. You do not need to be able to defeat the United States militarily to constrain American power. You only need to raise the cost of American action above the threshold of American political willingness to pay that cost. China has done exactly that, methodically, patiently, without firing a single shot. For you, sitting at home, watching your grocery bills climb and your savings lose purchasing power, the consequences of all this are direct and personal. If the petrodollar system fractures, the US government loses its ability to borrow cheaply. Interest rates rise. The cost of financing the national debt, already over $1 trillion a year, explodes. Social programs get cut. Infrastructure investment stalls. The standard of living that Americans have taken for granted, which has been quietly subsidized for decades by the dollar's reserve currency status, starts to visibly decline. That process is already underway. It is not a future risk. It is a present reality that is being obscured by financial complexity and political noise. The question you should be asking is not whether America can stop China and Iran at the Strait of Hormuz. At this point, the answer to that question is probably no. Not without costs that no current American administration is prepared to impose on the American people or risk on the world economy. The question you should be asking is what comes after? What does a world look like where oil is priced in multiple currencies, where the dollar is one reserve currency among several, where American military power is real but constrained, and where China sits at the center of a parallel economic and financial system that covers half the world's population and a growing share of its trade? That world is not coming. That world is already here. And the Strait of Hormuz, that 21-mile wide channel of water that you probably never thought about before today, is where it became undeniable.